Today on Messianicism, I'm going to be continuing the response video of Billy Carson and Paul Wallis's Bible study. And so we're just going to get right into it, and I hope you enjoy. Let's get to it. How do I get there? Here we go. Okay. Oh, where'd I go? I guess it doesn't matter. You don't need to see my face.
Even to the point of the church pushing back on new science and new discoveries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. It's there's a verse, because some people seem to get extremely agitated when they hear me talk about the fact that I believe that we are gods, that God is in us and we're inside of God. In other words, I believe that we're a fractal of God, not that we're a God that we can create a universe, but I believe in the fractal mathematics of the universe, and which is a mathematical formula that has been discovered and well documented called the Mandelbrot set. And that Mandelbrot set shows that we're living in this created reality. So yes, the Bible is right, the Quran is right, all these indigenous cultures around the world, I believe they're accurate. We're living in a creation. It just describes the mathematics behind the creation. And so if everything is a fractal throughout the entire known universe, I believe that a fractal of the God consciousness, the divine energy itself, is in every atom in my body. So yes, thereby, I am a fractal of God walking in the flesh, so that God can know what is it like to experience life through the eyes of Billy Carson. What is it like to experience life through the eyes of Paul Anthony Wallis?
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. It's a very Platonic way of seeing things, and I see it that way too. There's a moment in the
Okay. So I'm going to stop right there and just get started on my notes, I suppose. So the claim is that we are fractals of God, and I don't know Billy Carson's history, Billy Carson's history on fractals and his level of knowledge on fractals. It's one of those things that mystics tend to just kind of use without really a lot of understanding of it, in the same way as like quantum physics and stuff like that. And so typically when I try to like learn about that sort of stuff, I like to have a study partner who does know that sort of stuff, and I have a variety of them. So um, I guess the first thing I would say is the idea that we're fractals of God, depending on how you use that, it's not necessarily an unorthodox claim. Um, so what is fractal geometry? That is there are a couple definitions that you can use when talking about fractal geometry. One of them would be, for instance, um, the number of, what do you call them? They are the like square and cubed, not superscripts, exponents. Yeah, the exponent is actually a fractal. And so that would be one definition of fractal geometry. And the way that you can visualize that would be like, okay, well, how do you make a something three-dimensional? Well, you take or so two-dimensional. Well, a two-dimensional geometry would be something that you can square. And what you get when you square something is you get essentially, I guess, it times itself. Well, when you square the area, you get a copy of the shape that you're dealing with. And so let's say if you are dealing with a square and you square a square, you get the square times a square, and what you get then is just a square that's twice the width and height. And so then you could say, well, what about if you cube a square? Well, at that point you get a cube, and that's when you get into the third dimension, quote unquote. Well, if you are using fractal geometry under this definition, what you would the question you would ask would be, what sort of shapes can you multiply to get a replica of the shape, but the multiplication requires a fractal. So like not two, not three, but maybe 1.8. And so there are certain complex shapes that mathematicians have come up with that have sort of determined they have found that number and they found what we can do with that sort of fractal. And it's interesting. The other sort of definition that you could use when it comes to fractal geometry is if you zoom in or zoom out. And this I think is the definition that Billy Carson is using here. If you zoom in or zoom out of the shape, you will see essentially the same shape replicated at multiple layers of or multiple planes, you could say. So, for instance, if you were to take, hang on, actually, I'm just going to go to my screen share. I'm just going to show you. I'm going to show you what this is because why am I just talking about this? Let me go to, oh, where'd that go? I need to go to my screen share. Okay, I guess I have to press that. Okay, now let's go to this tab. So one, that's actually the first one that we see is the Mandelbrot set, and that's the one that Billy Carson used. Okay, but you have this triangle, and I forgot what the triangle is called, but basically, as you zoom into the triangle, I want to see it. See, okay, as you zoom into the triangle, what you see is the same triangle replicated basically ad infinitum. Now, this same triangle is the sort of thing where if you were to diminish or if you were to multiply it in order to get, or if you were to add the exponent to it and you were to expand the shape itself, then in order to expand the shape, it would require a fractal exponent. And so that's basically what a fractal is. It's every like as you zoom in, what you get is a replica of the overall shape in the smaller shape, and that's considered a fractal. This is another exa a good example of it. You have a triangle, then you have this triangle, and then as you add, if as you divide, not divide, as you subtract the shape of the triangle out of the triangle, like in the second image right here, then you get three triangles. And then you can do the same thing there and then do the same thing again. And that's how you eventually get the shape that we're talking about, a Sierpinski triangle. Well, what we have discovered, and I forgot his first name, but Mr. Mandelbrot in I think the 80s or something discovered that if you were to take imaginary numbers, which is basically a number if you were to not just use a number line, but use more like a number grid. Let me just imaginary numbers. Basically like this kind of number line. So you have the real numbers, which are on the horizontal axis, and the imaginary numbers, which are on the vertical axis. And he discovered that if you were to take the imaginary numbers and there's the Mandelbrot equation. Yeah, the Mandelbrot equation is z equals z squared plus c, which don't ask me to explain what that means, but basically what it means is when you multiply, when you square z plus c, you will, depending on c, where c is, and c is a particular number on the uh, imaginary number line. What you will get is in some locations, you will get a stable number, and in some locations, you'll get an unstable number. And the definitions of stable and unstable are if you were to multiply this equation, and every time you multiply it, you take C, and well, C is initially zero. But then every time you multiply this equation, you replace the result, or you replace C with the result. And you do that iteration, let's say 100 times. And the question is, does the when you do that 100 times, does it sort of collapse in on itself, or does it end up going outward into infinity? And the Mandelbrot set is a visual representation of all the points that kind of goes like more in on itself rather than expanding out into infinity. And there are like purely stable numbers, which are in the black. There are unstable numbers, which in this version would be in the red. In this version would be in the blue. And then there are also intermediate numbers, which would be the borders of the Mandelbrot set that you would see. Now, that's a version of fractal geometry. The interesting thing about this, though, that is sort of relevant to the discussion that Billy Carson is having is this set does not work in 3 dimensions. It works in 4 dimensions, and by dimensions, what they mean is essentially if you were to take instead of the XY axis, you add another axis to it, so XYZ. Well, it doesn't work in the XYZ axis, but it does work in the XYZ, and then I think they add J or something. XYZ J axis. So when you have 4 axes, that's when you are able to recreate a 4-dimensional Mandelbrot set. And when you are able to do that, the only way you can see what it would look like in a 3-dimensional space is if you were to take the 4-dimensional number or set and basically like cut slices out of it. And that's when you're able to sort of translate the 4-dimensional Mandelbrot set to 3 dimensions. But the important thing there is the Mandelbrot set doesn't work in 3-dimensional space. And so this is basically fractal geometry. The way that you can use fractal geometry when thinking about God and man is more just analogically. Like it can be used in an analogic way. Part of the reason for that is because God being eternal, he has to be infinite in multiple directions, in all the directions that are possible. And what that would mean is, for instance, the Mandelbrot set, you're able to zoom in infinitely and continuously find more and more of these. You're not able to zoom out infinitely. And that's kind of one of the problems with the Mandelbrot, or with equating the divine create or the God creation dichotomy with the Mandelbrot set, is if you were to try to sort of say that that the Mandelbrot set is like a a good way of discovering theology or something, you actually can't do that. What you have to do is you have to say, well, maybe this is a good way of like describing some of the mathematical equations that explain how certain phenomena arise in creation, but that's about as far as you can go. And you can say, well, this is sort of like discovering the divine order of the universe. However, the only way you would be able to, let's say, truly come up with a number or a set that could explain or be an analog to God himself, you'd have to be able to zoom out infinitely too and find the same sort of sets. And you're not able to do that with the Mandelbrot set. So it's one of those, again, it's one of those things that certain mystics and I guess Gnostics as well like to reference without much real knowledge of the actual set itself without much understanding of what fractals are. And it's kind of just weird. The other thing is the definition of fractal being that the small version of it, or as you zoom in, you get a replica of the actual um, of the larger uh, shape. That is where the analogy would break down because you do not zoom in to man and get a smaller complete version of God. And he even said this. He said that I'm not saying like that we are gods and that we can create our own universes or anything, but actually if we are fractals of God, then that would be one of the necessary components. We would need to be able to create our own universes. The better analogy would be fractals are inherently fuzzy geometry. That's another word for the sort of geometry that we're dealing with. And this is part of chaos theory and everything. And if you want to learn more about the history of it, you can read David Gleick's, I think David is his first name, but his book Chaos. And he just goes into the history of the theory and sort of where it's at by the time he wrote the book. And he goes into fractal geometry and explains it. And you can look at a variety of the ways that chaos is represented in our world. But one of the interesting factors of chaos is the butterfly effect. And when you describe the origins of the butterfly effect, what you got was this scientist who he was studying meteorology, and he was saying, or he was trying to predict weather patterns or at least predict the mathematical equations of weather patterns. And what he would do when he was putting these equations in an iterative process in his computer, which was an old computer, the computer kept bringing back like results that he couldn't predict. Like the math was not getting there for him, but the computer was getting to some other place entirely. And what he discovered was the computer could only calculate up to, I think, like three decimals. But the requirement for his mathematics was he needed, I think, 10 decimals or something along those lines in order for it to be more accurate. And part of chaos theory is that when you require more decimals and you cut off arbitrarily those decimals to a certain number of decimals, you get unpredictable results. And so, let's say if you were to ask a physicist now, especially a deterministic physicist, and determinism is not, I'm not using the philosophical term here, I'm using the physicist definition there. If you were to use, if you were to talk to a deterministic physicist, they would just say that chaos is unpredictable because it demonstrates not the limits of the universe, but it demonstrates the limits of our capacity to study the universe. And so the universe ultimately is predictable, but because of our own limitations, we can't go to the number of decimals that we would need in order to predict it. But the interesting thing about that is, let's say, and I've talked to some physicists about this, but like I'm not an expert in this field, so it's just something I've been thinking about, and um, I'm happy to be corrected on this. But if you were to take shapes in our universe, and let's say shapes that require an infinite number of decimals, for instance, a circle represented by pi is like 3.141 ad infinitum. There are an infinite number of decimals to pi. If you were to try to draw a circle in the universe, the biggest possible circle in the universe, and let's say take the Planck scale and draw a line until you get to the point where you need to just switch over to one Planck distance so that you eventually draw a full circle. Well, it's not an infinite number of decimals that is required for that. An infinite number of decimals for pi. Well, okay, so the what you can find is that if you were to draw a circle from one Planck space in the universe at the edge of the universe, draw it all the way around the universe, and then like arrive back at that one Planck space, I think it's I think you only need 68 decimals of pi in order to do that. And of course, what I'm saying is highly theoretical. When I asked the question, some of the people who responded were like, that's a kind of a stupid question. And so, like, you're going to get people who just don't think that that's at all relevant or at all like meaningful in any sort of way. Some people thought it was an interesting question, but like if you were to just take that and say, okay, you have a circle all the way around the universe, um, you don't need an infinite number of decimals to do that. And in fact, you could even extrapolate that and say there is not an infinite possible number of decimals in the universe because of the Planck scale, because the universe is not inherently infinitely divisible. That's what the Planck scale means. And and so what that means is you take you take geometric shapes and certain of them require an infinite number of decimals. Well, you do have in a real, like a very real sense, a somewhat arbitrary cutoff on the number of decimals that the universe can calculate in a way, which means that there is a certain sense of innate fuzzy geometry in the universe. And so if you were to, let's say, study the Mandelbrot set, study fractal geometry based on, again, fractal geometry is a subset of fuzzy geometry. Based on, and try to come up with some sort of like metaphysical claim based on all of that. What you can say is that the universe is inherently fuzzy, whereas in order to get these infinite decimals, you have to go beyond the universe or something along those lines. It's only theoretical, and you can't really say that a perfect circle exists in the sense of it of being able to calculate pi to infinity. Because in our universe that just doesn't exist. So I mean that's possible. Like it's possible to say something like that. It's kind of just the analogy breaks down eventually. The Mandelbrot set doesn't work in three-dimensional space. It works in four-dimensional space and two-dimensional space, and maybe it works in others, but those are the ones I know of that we've kind of tested it in. Um, and like, so I mean, there's that. So when you look at the Mandelbrot set and you say, oh, you zoom in and you see something that looks somewhat like a galaxy, it's difficult to say if that's actually if there's actually some sort of causation between the Mandelbrot set and our universe, because our universe is three-dimensional, Mandelbrot set is two-dimensional. But then again, when you talk about two dimensions, you're not really, in physics, you're not really talking about like something that has no height. What you're talking about is a an entity where the only necessary coordinates are two in order to know what you're talking about. So if you have a flat galaxy or something like that, then maybe they can like arrange themselves according to the Mandelbrot set. But we just don't know. We don't know what sort of correlation between the Mandelbrot set and the physical universe there is, if any. And so it's kind of just like if you talk about it, you're not talking from a place of knowledge. You're just kind of making stuff up. And I think that's one of the problems with Billy Carson here is he's just making stuff up. And so, can the case be made that we are fractals of God, maybe in an analogical way, but um, it the analogy breaks down really quickly. It like we're not fractals of God. Can you say that maybe I mean, we have the divine image on us? Well, that's a different claim, but we don't. entirely we don't entirely encompass, or we don't encompass the entirety of the Godhead like Jesus did. Jesus, what Paul says, I think in Colossians, he says, no, in Philippians 2, Paul says that in Jesus was bound the entirety of the Godhead. And that's a different claim than for humans. And part of what Paul is saying is Jesus is different from regular humans for that reason. We are not encompassing the entirety of the Godhead. So we're not fractals of God. You can say maybe we have characteristics that are fuzzy versions of the of the perfection of God. Like maybe our sense of goodness is like a fuzzy version of what the perfect version bound up within God would be. But that again is a very different claim. And so the basic conclusion that we can draw about the equate or the analogy of the Mandelbrot set and fractal geometry between us and God is to say that this means that we are gods is just a non sequitur. You don't get there from that sort of data set. Okay, so again, the question is when do you go too far with this sort of analogy? And when you start saying that we are many versions of the consciousness of God, and that we like through us, God is able to experience the universe, then you're going too far because you are diminishing God to us, and you're not allowing God to speak for himself in in that case. And this kind of goes back to the previous episode on Revelation. And this probably isn't something that I went into at that point, but there's this sense of like like there is philosophy and there is revelation. And Rudolph Bultmann has this great quote, and hopefully I can remember how it goes, but it's basically like um, all of history is a reflection of the reader. And the basic idea is when you look at history, you yourself are reflecting onto history your own personality, psyche, assumptions, and all of that sort of stuff. So, in other words, you are looking at yourself when you read history. You're projecting yourself onto history. And this is true for many other things. It's true for philosophy. Like, why are there so many philosophies? Why is it that some are more intuitive to certain people? Well, it's because that those people are reflecting onto philosophy themselves. They're seeing themselves in philosophy, and that's where they're sort of finding this idea of truth is ultimately they are finding that truth is bound up within their own self. And so when I was talking about philosophy and revelation in my last episode, one thing that I was trying to sort of demonstrate is that there's a certain limitation of philosophy. Humans are not omniscient, which means that when we look out at history, look out at philosophy, look out at any like science, even when we look at other people, we are inherently taking our own epistemic limitations and encompassing everything else into that, so that we sort of rebuild all of those other things into our own systems, our own models of the world, our own uh, cognitive biases, and everything like that. And so when you are taking philosophy of God, which is theology, and you're taking theology and turning God into a version of you, that's actually very suspicious. If God is always agreeing with you, you should really be suspicious of that. And like, because if God is not you, then he is someone else. And C.S. Lewis has a great quote in his book, The Problem of Pain, where he talks about morality and how um, there's a certain disconnect or balance that we need to strike because when we think of God being perfect in his moral intuition or moral knowledge, and we think of ourselves as being imperfect in our moral knowledge, then there's a certain degree of us saying that God's moral knowledge is not our own. And so we can say that, okay, when I think of God, or when I think that something is good, there's a possibility that God does not think it's good. And therefore, he's the one who's correct in that scenario. But the balance comes when you think that, or when God disagrees with everything that you think. And like there's a certain degree of, okay, well, if all of my moral intuitions are in disagreement with God, at what point do I say that also that's not God? Because, like, okay, um, murder and rape, let's just go with the big ones. If God disagrees with me on my intuitions on those things, then I don't know, that's probably not God. That's probably a demon. And that's kind of the balance that C.S. Lewis is trying to strike there when it comes to whether pain should be considered to be like a moral problem. At some point, God is more wise than me, and if he doesn't think it is, then I should probably just allow that to be the case. But at some point, if he's like so dramatically different from me, then maybe that should give me pause and think, okay, well, maybe it's not God that I'm hearing talk about this. And that's kind of the balance that you have to strike when it comes to revelation and philosophy. My reflection of myself onto God in theology, in like straight philosophical theology, is going to be wrong ultimately because I'm wrong. Like, I'm wrong about a lot of things. Why would I assume that I'm right 100% about God? And so God, again, if God is constantly agreeing with me, and that's all, like he has nothing better to do than to agree with me, then that's suspicious. And unfortunately, a lot of people, including a lot of Christians, fall into that. And I think that's where you get this disconnect between the ideal good Christian life and those people who corrupt it and cause these traumas and problems in the church that a lot of deists, Gnostics, and atheists point to as being problematic. It's because those Christians are not really worshiping God in the same way as they're worshiping themselves through God. And on the other hand, if God has nothing better to do but to disagree with me, then maybe I'm also not seeing God. So there has to be some sort of a balance. Like God is reasonable, God's rational. There's that. He's logical. So when you get things like God is only will and he's able to make goodness evil and evil goodness, that's that's probably not true. There's goodness exists. So like there's just this balance that you have to strike. But if you are projecting yourself onto God 100%, that's not God that you are looking at. That's you. And this is sort of what Billy Carson and Paul Wallis are doing. They're saying, well, I'm a fractal of God, which is a good way of reversing the order there by saying, or a good way of reversing what he's actually saying, which is God is just a reflection of me. And both of these guys are doing that. And this is why, when I was talking in my last episode about revelation, I was trying to build up a sort of a psychological epistemic basis for how you can know when something is revelation and how you can move toward it. Um, but you like it's important that you find that revelation because God speaks for himself. And if if we're not at least if we're not at least cognizant that he does, if we're not at least um, open to him correcting us, then I think that that's a problem. that seems to be a big problem. So the last thing I have on my notes here is consciousness is not fractal, and that's another problem with this analogy. Consciousness isn't a shape, and so you're not going to get like some sort of numerical value of consciousness. I think that's just qualitatively different than Euclidean geometry or any other geometry. So that's a problem. So let's get back to it.
The gospel, where people were accusing Jesus of equating himself with God, and he says, but doesn't the scripture say ye are all gods? And then there's a wonderful definition of God, the New Testament God, given by the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, chapter 17. He's talking to a non-religious audience. So they're not Jewish believers, they're not Christian believers. So he needs to clarify what he means by God. He's using the Greek word theos. And he gives a nice description of the Greek understanding of theos, their word for God, the word that Jesus used. And he said, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring.
Yes.
And I love that because I think that's a definition of God that people way beyond the world of faith could accept, could do business with.
Yeah.
It's saying my intelligence is a participation in one of the properties of the cosmos, intelligence. My consciousness is a participation in the consciousness that's endemic to the cosmos. And it comes back to what you were saying, the cosmos experiencing itself through what I see, through what I hear, through what I feel, through what I experience. And I find that a very empowering description of God because there's no separation in it. You and I couldn't be closer to the source by Paul's definition there. There's nothing we have to do to scramble back into the presence of God because we are all emanations of God.
Exactly.
I find it empowering. Religion trades on separation anxiety. Religion trades on the idea that you and I are separated from God and you need to do A, B, and C to get into his good books because you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. And we, the priests, or we, the teachers, will tell you how to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to, I guess, jump right in here. Yeah, so let's go back to the claim. Paul defines theos as the source of the cosmos, everything in it, that in which we move and live and have our being. All of us are his offspring. Yeah, I mean, it's not really true to say that he's talking to non-religious people. He's not talking to atheists here. He is talking to pagans, and he's using a poem about Zeus to ascribe the attributes that they typically think of as the attributes of Zeus to God, and saying, you guys kind of got some things right, but here I'm going to explain like the actual truth of the matter. I think the first thing is in all of the descriptions of Hashem as wicked and causing wars and all that sort of stuff, it's kind of contradictory to that claim because if that's the case, then even Hashem is a fractal of God and we are a fractal of God. So like you can't really ascribe wrongdoing to him if even in him we move and have our being and that sort of thing, because again, everything is a fractal of the consciousness of God, which is also, again, nonsense. So, first of all, not everything is God. Paul Wallis is he's describing a pantheism ultimately, because what is he saying? Through us, the consciousness of the cosmos experiences the cosmos. So what are the cosmos? I mean, unless he defines it differently, the cosmos is just the universe. And so if the universe is God, then that's like the straight up definition of pantheism. And the problem with pantheism is, well, the the 2,500-year-old Aristotelian problem which was incorporated by Thomas Aquinas, that if you have motion, if you have any sort of passage of time, and however you define that passage of time, then you have to get to a point where you have a first cause or a first actualizer. In Aristotle, it's the unactualized actualizer, and in Thomas Aquinas, it's the unmoved mover. So, like, if the universe is God and the universe is in motion, then that necessarily means that the universe is not eternal. And if the universe is not eternal, then it means it's contingent. It's possible that it does not exist. And if it's possible that it does not exist, then that means that it requires a necessary being to create it. And that's kind of the basic philosophical problem with pantheism. And when people begin taking God and just making the cosmos God, then you run into the same problems with pantheism. And th those are these Aristotelian and Thomistic problems. So also there are a couple things to note. Rocks are not God, evil is not God, and anything ultimately and anything contingent is not God because God is necessary. The universe is not a necessary entity. The universe is contingent, and so therefore the universe cannot be God. And then he had this other claim, religion trades on separation anxiety. There's also possibly the inverse of that, which is separation anxiety trades on religion. It's this is just again, this is one of those things that people say that like, oh, okay, if it's true, who cares? You know, we are not God. We are separate from God. And to say anything otherwise is to it's to be delusional. Like, how do you say that you are God? Really? Really? You are God? You're just that bright? You're just that special? Like, I have this joke. I'm an ENTP, and uh, according to the Myers-Briggs typology and everything. And so I'm part of an ENTP Reddit group because, it's fun. And then there's this one time where um, someone said that they are pretty sure they have an ENTP child and they're going on this to ask advice on how to be raised or how to raise her. And my comment was basically like, make sure that she gets religion because without that, that's the only way that she'll know that she's not God because we ENTPs can be pretty hubristic, especially early on in life. And that's kind of just it's such a I mean, certain people have that problem. Um, they have that such a high degree of delusional hubris that they can really say that, like, I am God. And I like I get that. I've had that level of hubris before, and I can still fall into that, but at some point, this is what religion prevents because it ultimately redirects your attention away from yourself so that you can think about who the actual God is. And that's one of the major virtues that people who are irreligious entirely lack is they essentially succumb to the first sin, which is either you're going to live eternally in communion with God by eating from the tree of life, or you're going to take your own way and exalt yourself. And that is the first sin. And that is essentially the sort of decision we have to make every day. And some people, like I guess Paul Wallis and Billy Carson, have just entirely given themselves to that temptation. And it's really sad, Like it's so sad to see that. Um, so yeah, okay, maybe separation anxiety trades on religion. There's this interesting idea, this interesting concept. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And if and in the history of religion, you have again like the concept of a heresy is not really like a heresy is not really a falsehood. I mean, it is false, but a heresy is more like when you take one true thing and promote that to the exclusion of all the other true things. And so, for instance, Arianism is that, okay, at some point, Jesus was begotten. So Arianism said, okay, well, I'm going to say that to the exclusion of Jesus as God. And so, therefore, Jesus is not God. He's a creator, a created being. And so, therefore, that became a heresy. On the inverse end, you had Nestorianism, which was the idea that Jesus was so much not human that he was kind of just like a god that entered into a body, sort of like a hand enters into a glove. But ultimately, the physical body of Jesus was entirely unimportant, and that was another heresy. So you get this kind of back and forth in the history of Christianity, where we're kind of trying to define what actually does the true faith mean, and and when you take one truth to the exclusion of all others, that one truth actually becomes a falsehood. And so God has said that we are not God. God has said that we have done some bad things, and like we have done some bad things. God doesn't do bad things, okay? That's just one of the very basic definitions of God is he is all good. And so he does not do evil. But we do evil, so therefore we are not God. And if we have done evil, and if we are not God, and let's say we're also finite, because we are not i- infinite by nature, um, then when we look towards the infinity of God and we look towards the goodness of God, and we get the inner sense that there is such a thing as infinity, such a thing as perfect goodness, such a thing as perfect home and perfect love, and we yearn for that and we seek it and like long for it, that sort of calling that God has to us in our spirit is like by definition us like at one point separate from him and coming into communion with him. And that is just the a fact of how the world works. That's how like creation is not God. And so if creation is not God, it is separate from him. And and if it is, then it's possible for creation to become more separate. And it's possible for creation to become less separate. And if creation was God, then like talk about separation anxiety. If creation is God, then you're not even separate from anything. You're just alone. Like there isn't anything else. And that's I don't know, that's just a really weird way of trying to make yourself feel good. Um, but no, creation is not God, and so creation is separate from God. And that means that there are ways and methods that God has provided in order for us to come into communion with Him. And if God just so happens to prefer to work through people, like who are you to judge Him for that? That's just such a stupid thing to do, to judge God for wanting to work through people and to think and to call him evil for allowing people to participate in his goodness is very silly, I think. So it's important for us to enter into communion with him and this whole idea of separation anxiety, it's just like rhetorical hogwash. And it's the same sort of stuff that Christopher Hitchens used to do. So, yeah. One second. Okay, so my daughter has told me that it's time for me to sign off. So that's what I'm gonna do. Say hi, everybody. She's not looking. She's not paying attention. So anyway, this is probably the last episode that I'm going to be talking about the whole Billy Carson, Paul Wallis Bible study fiasco thing. It's, I don't know. It's not the interesting stuff that I like. It's just kind of, it's just very basic stuff that people get wrong, and it's boring. It's really boring. So I'm probably going to be continuing with the series that I interrupted to do this in my next episode. However, I'm sure if you guys want me to continue with this, then I can probably accommodate that. If if um if not, then I'm just going to keep going with what I was doing before. So yeah, if you do have any recommendations of what you want to see, feel free to drop those in the comment. If you have any questions about this video, if you have any arguments against what I've been saying, then feel free to comment those down below as well. I'm happy to interact with you guys. And yeah, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. So have a wonderful, wonderful day. Shalom.